Hello friends, welcome to Dr. Ossai Physiology Academy, DOPA for short. This is the place where we'll make the learning of physiology easy, exciting, and effective. Thank you for joining me. If you're new to this channel, you're especially welcome. And if you love the content that we share, kindly click the like button and also the subscribe button. And don't forget to turn on the notifications so you don't get to miss any new content that we drop. All right, let's get started. Now, today, we are now going to focus deeply on the cell. Now, this cell has been magnified millions of times to make it this big so that we can see inside. There is always more than meets the eyes, because the cell in itself, the human cell, is invisible to the naked eyes. To give you some perspective, now, you know, when you are writing on Microsoft Word, okay, on your laptop, maybe the font size is around size 11, 12. You know how a full stop is the size of a full stop? That size of a full stop is 1,000 micrometers. You understand? Full stop. You know, the Americans, they call it period. Okay? British, we call it full stop. A dot. So that is 1,000 micrometers. The size of a cell, a human cell, is 10 micrometers. That means it's 100 times smaller than that dot. So you can't see it. Just imagine dividing that dot into 100 places. It becomes invisible to them. That's the size of one cell. Okay, so you need an electron microscope to really enlarge it more, and then you begin to see that within the cell there are different structures, components that make it function. Structure and function. And these things inside the cell, they are called what? Organelles. You know, you've heard of these things before. They're not new to you. Organelles. So that we're going to be looking at them in more detail, because the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. Everything you need to understand about the functioning of the mechanisms of function, which is what physiology is all about. You need to understand it from the different components. What are they there for? What exactly do they function, and how do they function? Okay, there are several of them. So we're going to be starting with the main, which I consider the most important component of the cell, and it is called the cell membrane. Cell membrane. That's what we're going to be discussing today. Now, the cell membrane is this. It's what surrounds the cell. It's what makes the cell an entity that is separate from its environment. Remove this cell membrane and everything just scatters. You know, within this cell is full of water. Okay, so that water, we call it cytosol. Okay, it's full of water. So when you remove the cell membrane, everything just scatters. Water, just like spilling water around. So the cell cannot exist without the cell membrane. That's why it's the most important. It's what makes the cell an entity in itself. So we're going to be looking at the cell membrane. First of all, before we go into, we've magnified this cell membrane because you can't really appreciate it from here. So we've magnified it here so you see what it's composed of. But first of all, we're going to be looking at the functions of the cell membrane. Apart from that, it's just a covering. What are other things that the cell membrane does to the cell? One of them, obvious one, protection. Anything that covers you logically protects you. Just like your house is like a covering that covers you from the outside world, from wind, sun, and all of that, rain, protection. Okay? So, number 2, the cell has this very important function called selective permeability. Selective permeability. What do you mean by selective permeability? It's trying to tell you that the cell, substances can pass through the cell. You know, the cell is in communication with the environment. Surrounding the cell, like we said, the environment is the internal environment, which is the extracellular fluid, interstitial fluid to be more specific. Okay, so it receives things from the cell. If the cell wants to excrete waste product, it will have to pass through the cell membrane. So things pass through, but not just anything. It has control. It selects what can pass. We'll look at the things that make it selective like that. So it's selective in the things it allows to pass, to enter, and the things it allows to go out. All right, so that's selective permeability. Then number 3, cell signaling. What do we mean by cell signaling? Cell signaling has to do with communication, but this time it's not necessarily through exchange and transport of substances. It's about sending a message. Just like I'm talking now and you are hearing what I'm saying, you're understanding, I'm speaking words. So the cell membrane, that is the first port of call when the cell wants to send a specific message to another cell so that the cell can respond and act. We're going to deal with that. Okay, it's a special lecture in general physiology, cell signaling and communication. So they first reach the cell membrane and they have certain receptors that can receive that message. Cells, they communicate through chemical means. Okay, so that's what happens. But let's leave it at that. Cell signaling and communication. We can add and communication. Okay, the cell membrane plays a very, very vital role in that. Then number 4, endocytosis. Endocytosis. What do you mean by endocytosis? Endocytosis is also a means of transport, okay, but it's a very special means. Endocytosis is special means in the sense that there is a very big, we call it macromolecule, that needs to go from outside into the cell, but it's too big to pass through the cell membrane. So what does the cell do? The cell engulfs it. It takes it like this, stretches its body. Very flexible. Cell membrane is very flexible. It takes it and covers. It's called an engulfment. One of the kinds of cells that does that a lot is white blood cells, especially the one we call neutrophils and macrophages. You're going to learn all that in blood physiology, learn about the blood. So endocytosis, you can also add exocytosis, which it's taking out big substances out into the internal environment. Endo is taking in, but it's using a special means, okay, that involves the cell membrane going inside during endocytosis and the cell membrane enlarging and going out, becoming larger. You're going to learn more of that on that special types of transport. Okay, then lastly, what we need to talk about is number 5. It's what we call cell adhesion. Now, the cells as they exist in the body, they don't exist singly like this. They exist just alone. No, they are tightly packed together. Okay, they're tightly packed together. tightly packed together to form tissues and then an organ. Okay, that's like you have the liver or the heart or the lungs are made up of cells, but they are tightly packed together. It's just like grains of sand when you use it to form a block. They are joined together. This is cement that now joins them together. So when they need to join together, it's the cell membrane that does that joining. Okay, we'll talk about that later, because they are what we call cell adhesion molecules that are located in the cell membrane that helps it to join with other cells to form a solid structure in the sense of tissue and organs. Okay, so basically that's you can see the different functions, very important, the cell membrane. So I'm now going to be looking at the specific components, structures, composition within the cell membrane that makes it perform all these things. We're going to be looking at that after this break. Right, welcome back. So now we want to now look at the specific structures what the cell membrane is made up of. Now, what the cell membrane is made up of are similar to the major classes of food, which, as you know, have lipids. So these are, we have lipids in the cell membrane, proteins, carbohydrates. Now, what are the kinds of lipids that are located in the cell membrane? Now you have what is known as phospholipids. You have cholesterol. You have sphingolipids. You also have glycolipids. Okay, but the most important and most abundant amongst the lipids is this one, the phospholipids. And why? Now look at this cell membrane very well. Okay, you will see that it has two sides. This side round, this round things here, and another round things here. Let me draw it for you so that you see it better. Okay, so it's something like this. So it has head and it has a tail. It has tail, head. That's what it's represented here like this. So these the tails, the phospholipid, we're talking about the phospholipids. The tails, they face each other, while the heads, they face outside. And why does it behave like that? Now the this phospho part of the lipid is water soluble. Now the cell, within the cell, all here, okay, within the cell, like we said, is water, cytosol, made up of mainly water, a lot of water. So this head is what we call hydrophilic. Okay, the head is hydrophilic. That means philic means loving, hydro, water loving. It loves water. That's why it's aligning to the water. It's facing the side that is water. Outside of the cell membrane too, you also have a lot of water, which is that interstitial fluid. So this other head, the head is also facing this outside that is water. Then the tail, this tail, which is the lipid, is made mainly of fatty acids. It is insoluble in water, so it is water hating, and we call it hydrophobic. Phobia, hate, hydro, water hitting. Okay, so it's running away from where water is. That's why they are facing themselves. So it now gives it an appearance of what we call a lipid bilayer. Gives it two layers, these two things like this. So this lipid, phospholipid, leads to what we call a lipid bilayer. Okay, so that's what the phospholipids they do. So because it has two parts, one that is water loving, the other one that is water hating, they are known as amphipathic. Okay, phospholipids are amphipathic. All right, so they form very important this structure in the cell membrane. It makes it looks like this lipid bilayer. So these are the other types of lipids that are also some of these things you see here. Yeah, the cholesterol is the next abundant lipid. Okay, and so on. So now let's go to proteins. We have two types of proteins related to the cell membrane. We have the integral proteins, integral proteins, and we have what's known as peripheral proteins. Now let us look at the integral proteins. The integral proteins, they go through the cell membrane. This is an example of it. So it spans the thickness of the cell membrane. Okay, and they are like that because of the function. Always remember that structure relates to function. Look at it here, it's another type. Okay, these are integral proteins. They span the thickness of the cell membrane. Now what do they do? Two major things that they do. One of them, integral proteins, is that they form channels. What is known as channels. Channels. So the channels could be ion channels, ion channels, or water channels. Okay, when it's water channels, it's called aqua pouring. Aqua pouring, water, aqua, water pour, water hole, a channel that allows water to pass. Okay, aqua pouring. Okay, then this ion channel can be, they are specific. You can have sodium ion channel, potassium ion channel, and so on, that allows those electrolytes, sodium, to pass through. Okay, so they're made up of proteins. Then you also have another set of integral proteins that are receptors. Okay, receptors. So because they span the thickness, we call them transmembrane receptors. They are used a lot in this cell signaling. Okay, they are also amphipathic. The fact that they span through the thickness of the cell membrane. So this part that is touching the extracellular fluid is hydrophilic. This part that is touching the intracellular fluid is also hydrophilic, and this part within the thickness is hydrophobic. So it's also amphipathic. Okay, integral proteins. These ones act as receptors that help to receive those chemical messengers and signals when the cell needs to communicate. It needs to send message or needs to receive message. Write more about that later. Then you now have the peripheral proteins. Let's look at it here. Peripheral proteins. They usually act as enzymes. Sometimes they are attached to all these integral proteins. Okay? They usually act as enzymes. Okay? Peripheral proteins. They are not attached within the thickness of the cell membrane. They're just close by, right? So those are peripheral proteins. Now let's talk about the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, they are not so abundant in the cell membrane. Let me show you the percentage. Now these lipids, they form 40% of the cell membrane. Okay, then proteins, they make up 55%. So you see already 95%. Then carbohydrates is just 5% remaining. So the carbohydrates are the ones that are represented by these elongated structures, carbohydrates. Okay, so what do the carbohydrates do? Now they form what is known as glycocalyx. Glycocalyx. So they form a certain kind of protection, okay, for the cell membrane, and they do a special function also known as cell-to-cell recognition, called cell-to-cell recognition. You know, a cell has all cells in the body, just like each person has your name, your surname, which is for identification. Okay, cells, they also have their ways of identifying themselves. The body has a way of identifying each cell. That's why when a foreign cell enters, the body is able to spot it because it recognizes it. So this glycocalyx, they play that role, and sometimes they come in the form of what is known as, you see that they are attached to proteins, so they come as proteoglycans. Okay, let me write it here. Proteoglycans. They can also come in the form of what is known as glycosaminoglycans, GAG for short. Okay, glycosaminoglycans, and also glycoproteins. So those, they act to help in cell-to-cell recognition. So these are, it's not so difficult, just systematically. Lipids, proteins, carbohydrates. In normal classes of food, you know, those are the things that make up the cell. Proteins more, the highest, followed by lipids, then carbohydrates. All right, so this is what basic thing you need to know about the cell membrane with all these functions that we've mentioned. All right, so we're going to see you in the next lecture.